Alright guys, in this video we'll take a tour of Dart language. Now if you are an experienced programmer or if you feel like your fundamentals are clear about the object-oriented programming, you might find this video very basic. So in that case, please feel free to skip ahead and watch later videos. You don't need, Dart is not a very difficult language. It's very simple language when it comes to the object-oriented programming. Now we are going to review very high-level Dart concepts required to get you started with Flutter because Flutter uses Dart language to build all of its components. So we'll start with the OOPS concepts. So these are the 6 fundamental building blocks of the object-oriented programming: object, class, inheritance, polymorphism, abstraction, and encapsulation. Now, what is a class? So think about class as a logical entity. It's a collection of objects. It's a blueprint, it's a set of instructions which are required to build something. So for example, suppose in our restaurant app we have the whole functionality is, okay, somebody takes the order and it delivers to the kitchen and the orders get paid, and there are items you can review. So how you will divide this particular app into classes. So think about very high level classes. Okay, I have a class which takes the order, which is responsible for taking order, and I have another class which is responsible for making the food, and the third class is which is responsible for handling the payment details. So you can, it's a method, it's a blueprint of dividing your work into different pieces. So this is a very high level definition. Now, what is an object? So object is an instance of the class. So class doesn't take any space in the memory. It's a set of collections. It's a behavior. It's a blueprint. Now object is the actual thing. Object is actually the piece of functionality which will give you to handle one particular thing. For example, taking orders, dealing with the food. Second thing is dealing with the kitchen. It could be another object which is an instance of the another class. Now, another concept is inheritance. So what inheritance allows you? It allows you to, inherit. That means borrow, or suppose you have hierarchical structure, so you can borrow the properties and behavior from your superclass. Polymorphism, what it does, so suppose you have you borrow something from your parent class, but you want to override certain behavior because you have a different way of doing something. All restaurants are not equal. Your restaurant might have different behavior of cooking food, but actually you are cooking food, so you can inherit the cooking food class, and then you can implement your own behavior, which is it's called polymorphism. Now, what is abstraction? Abstraction is a concept where you hide the complexity of your program. So for example, your kitchen staff doesn't need to know how your waiter is taking the orders, things like that, or how the payments are handled. So you can abstract all those concepts in their individual classes. So what it gets you, so it allows you to hide the complexity in the different classes. Not the hide the complexity, that's encapsulation. So actually you abstract, you group certain kind of behavior in one particular class, so that kitchen staff, like other classes, they only get what they want to get. It doesn't need to know the whole functionality of the particular class. Now, the last thing is encapsulation. So encapsulation is the way hiding the complexity of the one particular class. So for example, the waiter is taking the order, but he doesn't, and somebody is cooking the food. So waiter, he doesn't need to go and tell these guys, okay, you are cooking the food. He can give the feedback, he can tell you, okay, your food was good or bad, and patient, your plates were broken, something like it, but he cannot go inside the kitchen and start making changes. So but still, once the food is delivered, he will take the food and he'll serve it back to the customer. So again, he is not allowed to change the behavior and properties of the kitchen itself. Okay, but he still is a consumer of that kitchen class. So that's kind of you can achieve this behavior using encapsulation. Now, again, don't worry about that if you didn't understand this concept, because these are physical, only it's just a concept right now. It's theoretical stuff. Once you start working on the actual code, and once you learn how these concepts are actually implemented practically, then I bet you will have a better understanding of this concept. So now enough with the theory. Let's get started with the practical itself. Now let's start working on the Dart. In past video, you saw that we have already started Flutter and Dart on our Visual Code Studio Code. So now we can just start typing our Dart language here. Now, if you do not have access to Android Studio or VS Code and still you want to get your hands on Dart, I highly recommend that you go to dart.dev and just go to try Dart. So they give you a Dart pad and you can just practice, learning Dart on this Dart pad. Alright guys, so let's get started. First thing I'm going to do inside the blank directory, as you can see, I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call this file as test.dart. So all the dart files, they end up with an extension dart, okay? And the way you run that, this particular dart file here, if you go to any command prompt window, okay, and browse through this directory, let's go to the terminal, okay? And then all you have to say dart and you say test.dart. So when I hit this command, obviously it's not going to do anything because you know what, there's no nothing inside there. And as you can see, this error is very clear. It's saying the binary program does not contain main. So what is main? Main is actually entry point of any file. So for example, any dart file. So in the test.dart file, as you can see, I have no main. So let me write a main method first. So first thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to say void main. Now at this point, don't worry about if you don't understand what this void is, what this main is. We are going to cover this in a minute. So next thing I want to do here, inside void, I'm going to create a for loop. Now I'll have it initialized with an integer. I'm saying integer I equals to 0 until is less than 5. Just increment integer by +1 every time. So again, we'll cover this control flow statements later. And inside this loop, every time what I want to do, I want to print hello, and then I want to print this integer value. So I will say dollar and I +1. So this it's called interpolation if you're coming from the web framework world. What I'm going to do, every time I'm going to capture the word I and I'm going to print it +1 and I'm going to print it here. And now what you can see here, I want to mention one thing. If I don't put this $sign here, is going to print hello curly braces I +1. It doesn't understand that what I is. So to make this print statement understand what I is, that it's a variable, I am putting the $sign here. And even better, if you can, what you can do, so you can, I'm going to put another print statement here just to show you the type of A. So is I.runtime. So actually it's not A, it's an I. So now let me save this and run this command so you will understand what's going on here. So now this time I hope it doesn't complain about the main. Why? Because when I run this dot file, it understands what the main function is and find the main function, it goes inside this, and as you can see, it will do what is asked me to do. And it has been asked to print out a couple of hello world commands. So as simple as that. So next thing is let's start digging into more about the Dart. But just want to mention this very quickly here. Main is the function, is the entry point of any Dart program. So next thing I want to cover here. So in any programming language, I think the most important thing you will ever write in any object-oriented or any programming language is the comments. So first thing you have to do, so the way you write the single line comments, and what comments are, if you start a string with the 2 front slashes, that means it's going to tell a dot compiler that this is not the actual program, do not execute that. This is just the helpful comment. So second thing, there are 3 different ways you can write the comments in Dart language. First is the single line command, and second, so for example, I want to say, main is the entry point for Dart. Second way you can write the comments is multi-line comments. So for example, you have more than 2 or 3 lines you want to write, you use the multiple lines comments like this. Now what are multi-line comments? So the information I think which is useful as a general information like table of contents, output those kind of a thing into this table, into this multi-line comments. The third type of comments what Dart delivers you is the documentation comment. So it starts with the 3 front slashes here, and here actually I'm supposed to write the main is the entry point for the Dart here, into this documentation line. So why it is so important? Let me tell you one thing, how to, if you in future when you are writing your code and if you ever get in trouble. So suppose you want to see what the heck this print function is. So right click on this one, go to definition, and you will see, look at this, the way Dart programmers have written the comments. This is all the copyright statements, and this is like again the single line comment, and whenever it comes to the explanation, when they are saying, okay, what is this print function does, it starts with the 3 front slashes. That's why it's called documentation type of comments. So that's all about the comments. Now, all right, guys, so let's talk about the functions. Um, when a function doesn't return anything, it's a void. So let me try changing it to a string. Now, as soon as you change to the string, you will see an error. Let's mouse over to this one, and you can see this function has a return type of a string, but doesn't return with a return statement. So what this is saying that, you know what, this is not a appropriate function because it's not returning anything. So let's go and return something. Say, you know what, something. So as soon as you do that, I see that error goes away. Now this is what I meant by the void. So void, when you put the void, that means like you don't expect anything to return from this function. Now if you do the void, then it will start giving you the error that the function is marked as void, so you cannot just return anything from out of it. Next thing I want to cover is about the objects. So one thing to keep in mind in Dart, everything is an object. So any number, integer, or even the null value you see, everything is an object. Let me show you what I mean. So for example, integer I. So if I do an I dot, you will see there are a lot of like different methods I can apply to this integer I, and all of this. So object derived, they are an instantiation, they are an instance of a object class. So everything, just keep that in mind, that everything is an object. And also functions, they are like, first class objects. So anything, and once you see that like, in practical, you'll understand what I mean. But just to keep, for now, just keep that in mind, then everything will be passing through a value or reference. Everything what we'll be doing in Dart is an object. Talk about the types and the variables. So in Dart, the way to declare a variable is just say variable my name equals to anything. So in this case, if you mouse over to this one, you can see Dart can infer data types. So what does it mean? That even if you don't put the data type in front of that one, and I will cover data types in 1 minute, like in later, but just to give you some idea, data type is like, suppose there's something called integer, or it's a string, or it's a value, it's a number, it's a double, it's a floating number, something like it. So Dart can infer the data type. Next thing I want to show you, so you can also, if you already know the data type, and if you want to impose something, you can put the, instead of putting the var, just say string, and you give a name to your data type, give a name to your variable, and you assign that value to this one. So that's another way to declaring variables here. If I always, I think is good practice whenever you are declaring your variables, if you already know the data type, or even if you have some idea that, okay, this is the data type I'm going to be using for this particular variable, please use this practice and try to give a type. Next thing is, if you don't know the type, then use the word dynamic. So again, these are 3 different methods you can use to declare a variable. If you don't know the data type, put a dynamic. If you know it, then put the string. Or you can just like declare something if you want to have a local, something like, just start with var. There's one more way, you can just say, so suppose for example, you don't want to like, give it an initial value. So you can just always say dynamic my name 4. And it happens a lot whenever you are expecting something from the server and you want to get that JSON into, store that temporarily locally, and you don't even know what the data types, then it's okay to use this kind of dynamic declaration of the variables. Now one thing I want to show you, you cannot do it like this. You cannot say my name 5 equals to, and you just assign it to any value. So just if you mouse over to this one, you will see very clearly, whenever you are defining a variable in data type, you must be using some keywords like constant, final, var, or you have to have a type name. Otherwise, it's not a good practice. I think Dart will not even allow you to clear those variables, to declare those variables. Okay. Move on to types. I want to show you 2 more things here, final and constant. So what is final? So we just declared a variable of type string where I'm storing the value, say name, and this is final. So what does final means? Final means it's a value which cannot be changed. Now then what is constant? So constant, as you can see, is a similar thing. Constant is a thing, constant is a variable which cannot be changed. So what is the difference? So the only difference you will see, constant is something which is literally cannot be changed. Now final, if you declare a variable of type final, it cannot be changed, but provided there is a condition that you can instead give it an initial value at the time of when you are constructing an object. Again, later on when you will initiate an instance of an object from a class, you will understand how I'm using the final and constant. So for example, in my app, I want to use the values which are never ever going to change, put that at constant. But in sometimes I want to invoke a function and I want to give it an initial value which is not going to change, then I will use the final. So again, just to recap, the difference between final and constant, sorry, the similarity is both, once they are assigned to a variable, those variables cannot be changed. The difference between those two is final, it can have an initial value, and once it has an initial value, then it can never ever change. Constant is always have something and it will never ever change during the life cycle of your app. So that's the difference between final and const. Now let's talk about the types. So by default, dot gives you a plenty of different data types. So let me show you what those are, like numbers, string, booleans, list. Lists are also known as arrays if you are coming from Python or Java or C++ background. They also deliver sets, maps, runes, and symbols. So let's get started with numbers first. So numbers, as you can see, these are the variables, these are the data types. It lets you store any kind of number. So for example, I can have a 3 and I can store to a variable. By default, you will see is smart enough to know that actually 3 is an integer. So dot can infer the data types automatically. Next thing is, okay, you can also like declare a variable of type integer. You can also do a double. What double is actually, it lets you store the decimal points, very simple. But you can also, you cannot have the decimal point number stored to an integer. This is actually wrong. So to the correct way to have a floating value assigned to a variable, just like declare it with a data type called double. Now if I go and try to print this z, so pay attention to this, z is actually 4. Let me just comment this one, otherwise it's not going to run. So if I go and run this program, so please see that the value of the z you will see is 4.0. Now it knows that this is, even though like an integer is assigned to a value double, but it's going to print like as a decimal value, as a double value. Fair enough. Now let's talk about the other data type, which is a string. So let me get rid of this one, string. So the way to declare a string, you can also, nothing stops you. You can have a string stored to a variable, but the correct way to define a string is like, you have to infer the data type, saying a string s2, and you can store any string into your variable here. Now another way, if you have a text which is split in different lines, you can always do that, because it is smart enough to the string data type is smart enough to know that how to join, how to put all these strings together in one variable. So it will give you the same results. Now if you have you can also use the 3 single quotes to capture your string and store into a string data type variable here. Now while I'm here, let me show you one more thing. You can also store the raw string, and the way to store the raw string is you have to just put the r in front of the string you want to store. Next thing is, I also want to capture the boolean. Boolean, again, as you say, is stored to, it lets you store the true and false. So for example, if you have a string which is blank, so you can always check that if this string is empty or not. So I'm going to call a function on the string, which is like my name and is empty or not. So if it is empty, so print is empty. If it is not, it's not equal to empty. But you can also store this, the value of this thing is going to be a boolean, is true or false. So that's how and we will be using this kind of single line conditional statement a lot in our in follow-up tutorials. So these are actually nothing but plain simple if and else statement. So but we'll be using a lot of boolean values to check conditions on our data types. Let's talk about the list now. Okay, so let me get rid of this one. Now list, as I said, these are in other language, you also known as an array. So what it does, it's a list of things. It lets you store different values inside one big giant array. So, and I'm telling you, in follow-up tutorials, we'll be using the list a lot, because that's where you store the data which is coming from the server. So this is the way you can declare the list. As you can see, it lets you store the different values separated by comma. And as you can see, this list actually is a type of, like, all the variables stored in this one, they are of type integer. So you can also declare the data type, what kind of data types I'm storing into the list. And actually it's a very helpful feature, as you will see in follow-up videos. Now, let me put a string here. So as you can see, like, if I declare a list of type string, it won't let me store the integer. This is wrong. So if your list type is a string, or if you want to, like, like store a mix of strings and integer, then still you have to, like, keep your list data type equals to a string. No mix and match is allowed. Okay. Now you can also, at any given point of time, if you want, you can just, like, call a function called length, and it will give you a length of that particular list. That means like how many items you have in your list. Okay, now let me comment this out. Next thing I want to talk about is the sets. Now, what is a set? Set is like a list, but it's a little bit different. It lets you store an unordered collection of unique items. So let me give you an example. So for example, I have a list of names, and I have 3 different names stored in a set. Sorry, I keep on saying a list. It's a set. So in set, I am storing 3 different strings, Amit, Shukla, and the person. Okay, and let me create another set, and here I'm storing the 4 different fields. So again, it's an unordered collection of unique items. So that means, what if I go and try to print this out? So let me save this. So if I'm going to run this program now, do you think, like, so the names and the names to sets will be equal? Why? Because as you can see, it's only let me save an unordered collection of unique items. So it's going to sort out the order, but again at the same time is going to get rid of the duplicate. Let me show you. Let me run this program, test. Okay, as you can see, definitely it's printing it so many times because it's inside the for loop, but the bottom line is, like, it gets rid of, it's ordered that list, it gets rid of that duplicates automatically. So that's a very nice, like, a handy feature, and I see a lot of, like, places I will be using sets in near future. So this is a very nice data type to know. Now let's move on to last 3 data types: maps, runes, and symbols. So okay, about the map. So the only difference between lists and map is, map, it allows you to store key value feature. So if you're familiar with the JSON format, that means JavaScript object notification formats. So all the values are stored in a key when value pair. Let me show you what I mean. So for example, if I declare a map of person names, so I can store 2 different values here, and they are, like, identified key value. So the key is first name and the value is Amit. Last name is another key, and this is the value. So key value, so they are actually separated by commas. That's how you declare a map. Again, it's a very handy data feature, and most of the time, I think 95% of the time when you're working with the REST API, the data you get nowadays from the different REST APIs, either you subscribe to XML or you use a JSON. So if in case, like, if you're working on the JavaScript notification, that means JSON variables, map is a data type you want to store all of those values, what is coming from the server or REST APIs, into the map data types. So that's why it's very extremely important to know how the map data type works here. Now let me show you one more example. I'm going to temporarily create a class. So now again, don't worry about what this class is, because I will cover that later part. But for example, suppose there is a class and there are 2 variables in that class, first name and last name, and this is how, there's a constructor, and that's how you create a class. So suppose you want to create a new object of the class. So the point is, so you can have, going back to the map, you can have a list of maps. So for example, I create a new list. Now this list is of type person name, and in this new list, I'm going to create different persons. So each person is going to be defined by like this. So for example, this is one person. So suppose I want to have another person, which is of the data type map. So it's a list of maps. So I hope I'm not confusing you, but so let me just do it like in new. So that's how, I'm going to create an instance of this particular class. So what this is giving me is giving me an object. Object, that means is a map, of that person name. So again, it's like, if you find it little hard to digest, again, once you see the real live data, it will make more sense to you. So let me store another person here, and why is giving me error? Okay, so now as you can see, so it lists me, in a list. That's why lists are so important. A list allows me to capture a list of maps. That means different values. So again, list and maps, they are very, very powerful data types. Now, while I'm here, I want to cover the other last two parts, like in your runes. So runes, again, it's suppose if you want to store some ASCII characters of, like, the real raw input from the keyboard for any reason, and I can see the reason. If you're working on a gaming app, or some other app, like, then you might want to store a couple of, this kind of data types. So runes is another data type. It lets you store, the Unicode characters in a string. The last data type is symbols. So for the similar reasons, if you want to, if you ever have a need of storing the symbols, nowadays people have emojis, like, you want to store a little tiny favicon or PNG picture or icon. So symbols, it lets you allow to do that. So for example, radix, and or you can have some kind of a bar. So I think that's pretty much it. Most of the time, again, I just want to reiterate, like, the most of the times I see a lot of use for lists and maps, and of course the numbers and strings and booleans, but these are the data types, and I think these are more than sufficient. It lets you handle most of the functionality in your Flutter or Dart app. Let's talk about the functions now. So at the very beginning, I told you that main is the entry point for the Dart language program. So in this Dart file, this is where the compiler, when it first time it runs the Dart program, that's where it hits. The function actually is the I would say the heart of any Dart file. That's where you write your business logic. So once again, let's review that. So this function is a void. That means it's not returning anything. Now, you can always write the functions which are supposed to return something. So for example, I'm saying get menu name is a function, and I want to call it that function, and each time I call this function, I want to return a string. Very simple. So here I have to write a return, and I return something, say French fry. So this is a very simple function. It returns a string. Now let's go look at some more complex functions. So for example, if I am expecting a Boolean value from a function, I can also write a function like that. Okay, tell me if this dish is spicy or not. So I say, okay, it's have to type Boolean. Now the problem is, no, not the problem, like, you don't know what dish I'm talking about. So what I want to do here, I want to pass a dish name as a parameter. So what this function is going to do is going to accept a dish name, and it will say, okay, and it will pretend that it's going to server logic and not, and it goes to the review and figure it out, okay, it's a spicy or not. So all, in this function, what I want to write, it takes a dish name as a string, and then it returns the dish name. If it equals to French fry, I say, you know what, it's not spicy, or it says spicy. So things like that, probably this logic might not even be making sense, but I just want to show you how the functionality of the functions works here. Okay, now let me show you another function here. So this time again is the same function I'm doing, but I'm just creating a duplicate of this one, but I want to show you a very nice functionality. It's called arrow function, single line function. Some people call it like arrow notation. So what I'm trying to do here, instead of writing it like this, I want to write it a single line. Why? Because I don't think, like, you need the this open and curly braces. So it's just like different way of doing this thing. So it just like it looks pretty cool. And most of the times when you're writing functions very fast, so it's just like another way of writing functions. Okay, that's called like single line function. So same thing I'm going to write here, dish name equals to, but here let me just do something very different here. So instead of like taking a string, now here see how you can the point I want to show you, that I can call another function inside a function. So here I'm just like calling another function, get menu name, which is going to return me a string, which I'm going to compare with the string which I'm accepting as a parameter into another function. So I hope it's not very confusing. That's why I'm trying to make it very simple. And then you do the same thing. If it is like French fries, then you say, okay, you know what, it's not spicy, otherwise it's spicy. That's another way of writing the functions here. Okay, now let me show you another thing here. So what I want to show here, like, okay, you can pass more than one string as parameters. So, and same thing, so you can do like, all sort of calculations within that function here. So probably, you will see a lot of code like that. So that's where actually the point is, like, you handle all your business complex, business rules, business processes, you write those in function. But again, in general, in practice, like very standard practice, don't write over complex functions. In my opinion, like, maximum 5, 6, 10 lines. If you end up writing more code in a function, then it might become very complex. So in that case, like, I think you should create another function. There's no harm in, like, calling function inside a function. Why? Because function in dot language, they are considered as first class objects. So that's another concept. In the beginning I told you everything is an object. That's the good thing about dot. So when you say function is a first class object, so like, what I want to show you, so suppose you have a function, it takes an element and prints the element. Now what I want to do, this function accepts a parameter and it does something. Now the point is, like, I want to call this function and pass this function as an object. So for example, here what I want to do, this function print element, I want to pass this as a parameter. That's what I mean when I say it's a first class function. So for example, I create a variable x, and for on the list I'm going to create a loop on that one. I will just call this functions. So this is what's called, like, when you're passing the functions as parameters. So that's what I meant to say when functions are first class objects. Again, once you see the real life code, you will understand a little better, like, how you are passing the entire objects when you're handling the gestures, or like, some input from the data element, and you are passing the entire value as a parameter. So how you can pass the widgets and those things, those are high level concept. Again, once we go to the Flutter, we are going to cover those in detail. But for now, it's very important to know that in dot everything is an object, and functions are also considered as first class objects. You can pass functions inside a function as parameters. So let's go ahead. I believe that's pretty much it. So now the last piece I want to cover, the functionality. This is the function. This is called asynchronous functions. They are little special type of functions. So let me write up an example. All right, so asynchronous function have a special meaning in dot language and in any other language. So what happened in asynchronous programming, that if you are expecting something which is going to happen in future. For example, I go to the Google and say, okay, I'm search for something and it returns some results. So same thing, like, so for example, I'm loading a file, or if I'm going to the server to the database, I'm loading a lot of string into my app. So during that time, you cannot predict that, you might have little bit understanding. It might take 3 seconds or 4 seconds by the time the data comes back. So these are called asynchronous, like, asynchronous functions. So for example, I have a function which is expected to have some values in near future. So for example, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, and 10 seconds. Now during that time, you have two options. Either you continue doing the other things, or you halt your application, or you might do the both. Let me show you what I mean. So for example, I load some strings from submenu, but you know what, my waiter cannot take the order until he has loaded that the menu items in an app. So you cannot call the take order functionality, take order function, until and unless the menu items are retrieved from the server. Or, but at the same time, there is some other customer is doing something, you can do handle that. For example, payment functionality. Let me show you this in an function. So for example, fetch submenu. So I'm fetching the submenu from the server, but I know that, from the database. Okay, I know that, I don't know, submenu might be there 100 items there, and my server connection is slow. So in that case, I will mark this function as a future. So what this function is going to do, it will return me an object of type future. Okay, so very simple, just like it's no different than, declaring if another function which is called string or void. So instead of string or void, this time I'm saying future. So it's going to return me a type of object which is of type future. Now another mark I want to do here. I'm saying, okay, I can mark this. This is called like a modifier. I'm saying, okay, this function is of type asynchronous. Okay, so for example, then I have a data variable here, and what I want to do, I want to load this data from the server. So there's another functionality called root bundle. Again, I will cover that when I cover the different packages. But for now, just like pretend that root bundle is something which can get the data from the server. So for example, I have a file, I have all those JSON, all the data locally stored, and I want to get that data into a variable called data. Now this is what you will see await. So what this await is going to do is going to wait. So for example, I want to use this data, so I say what, json.decode data. So this L actually, so the point I want to make here, this L will not perform until and unless data is ready. So for example, if you mark this function as an asynchronous function, and if you use the keyword await, what await does, that this will not go to the next line. And it makes sense because you cannot, now you start working on the data, and data is not even fully fetched from the server. So what is saying, what, hang on until and I get all the data from this JSON file loaded into this data variable, then only go to the next line. So it's as simple as that. Asynchronous programming is like, and you have a choice. If you want to continue, don't do anything, just what, that's it, nothing stops you, so you can go and move on to the next line. But you won't be able to, if you run this function, what data is going to return is going to say future, or it doesn't have anything. So because the data is not fully loaded yet. But if you use the word key await, what it's going to do is going to give you the value of data. So that's basically, in a nutshell, very high level, that's asynchronous programming, and that's how you write the asynchronous functions, functions in Dart. Alright guys, so let's move on to the next section. So very quickly I want to cover, next thing is operators. So operators, again, these are the mathematical or Boolean operator or logical operator. It's very simple to understand, like when I say mathematical operator is like plus, minus, multiplication, division, things like that. So again, I assume that you have a fundamental high school mathematics understanding. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that one, on operators, but I want to quickly show you what are these operators. So for example, there is a plus operator, and there is a minus operator, and there's a multiplication, division, and there's a modulus operator. Actually, it's not actually modulus. So for example, in most of the other programming language, you will see a remainder operator, but here, like you have a little bit different. If you have a tilde followed by a front slash, it will give you, it will return you the result in an integer. So again, you can do a lot of different mathematical calculation inside a this brackets, and again the standard rules of mathematics apply. So for example, if you had to solve this mathematical equation in the in a notebook, so simple, the brackets, and even I forgot the high school math, like so multiplication is followed by division and things like that. So all those standard rules will be followed. And then there's a logical operator. It tells you, okay, equals to or not equals to. So basically it's very standard, like any other programming language, like greater than, less than, greater than, equal to, less than, equal to. Sorry, I'm not going into the details of the operators. I just assume that you have understanding, fundamental understanding, and I don't see anything big here. The only, and this is, for example, a logical operator and operator. It gives you this little bit different. So for example, here, this is how you mix and or. So for example, you have and in some language you will see this, in other language they put an exclamation marks here. In Dart you put a tilde character. So that's the only difference. Keep those in mind. So again, you can refer to the dot.dev manual, and they have, like I just copied pasted from there because I don't want to spend too much time on the operators here. So again, very simple, standard operators they are given. Now next thing, let's start working on our control flow statements. That means like if else statement, for loop, those kind of a thing. Again, those are very standard, but let me just show you a couple of examples. All right, so I think we have already seen first example control flow statement where I have walk you through the for loop. So again, it's very for loop. For loop takes three parameters, the integer, and then it second condition until this integer condition, how long it will go, and the third condition, which is going to increment the integer by +1 every time. So good, you can write everything, all of those things in one line, in one expression here, and then you do something inside that for loop. So for loop again is going to until that condition is met. That means I is less than than 5 is going to start doing what has been asked to do. Very standard, like any other programming language. Their for loop, dot for loop is no different. Second thing is while loop. So it's very similar to the for loop, but only difference is while is executed at least once. So and then you have a do while. So for example, same thing, just like the while, but first you have to do and then you do, then there is a do it until this condition is met. So different way of achieving that same looping functionality. You also have the break and continue. So the last thing I want to cover very quickly is the switch case. So because I like switch cases. Whenever you have, if you have too many nested if and else loop, I highly recommend you should be using the switch case. So for example, basing on some command, and you can define different cases, and it saves you whenever, like, do not write, if you have more than, rule of the thumb is if you have more than 3 if else statements, I would rather use the switch case. Then it makes it very easy. So it just directly go inside this where the condition has been met. It's not going to just process if else, if else, if else. It doesn't, nowadays computing is very, very fast, so you don't see the difference. But again, it's a standard way of doing that. So if you have more than 3 or 4 if else statement, consider those, nesting those inside the switch case. So I think that's pretty much the control flow. Now I think now let's talk about the classes and objects, and of the all the object-oriented programming concepts. All right, guys. So now let's talk about the toughest part of the dot language or any language. So OOPS concept. So again, in the very beginning, we talked about what is object, classes, inheritance, polymorphism, abstract, and encapsulation. Again, these are just the concepts which helps you uh, deliver a good quality application. So in this way, again, we're going to touch base on the high level concepts, but once you see the real thing in action, then it will make a lot more sense. But let me just, first let's talk about what is a class. So for example, you have an item. So anything, as I said, like, you can, is a class. Class is a collection of the objects. It's a behavior where you set up a pattern where you want to achieve a particular functionality. Now, so abstract classes, what is that abstract classes? That you want to have one functionality and you want to group together everything all together in one class. So for example, in this case, this is not the abstract class example. I just want to tell you just in generic what is a class. So for example, there is an item. Now in class, I have a set of variables. So for example, submenu ID or menu ID, menu type. So again, you might be asking, what are these things? Again, once we start working on the Flutter and our restaurant management app, first session I'm going to cover is the how to plan the database. Then we'll talk about, like, why I came up with these fields. And if you're working on MySQL or MongoDB or Firebase or any database, so how to design those things, we'll discuss those later. But for now, let's pretend that these are the fields I need to have when I'm defining an item. That means a menu item. So suppose it's a French fry. So it's a French fry. I give it an ID 1234, and it belongs to a menu ID. That means a menu type is a starter. So suppose it's a starter, and then you give it a name, French fries, and you have description that, okay, these are the potato French fries on. Then you give it a tooltip. Tooltip means, like, suppose somebody gives a mouse over, to that particular image, what it's supposed to tell you. And then you have an image, things like that. You have also kind of have a recipe and review. Again, it's not a good idea to store reviews and recipe here. You can have a subclass, but just to set up an example, these are all of the things I need to define one class, and this class is an item. That means a menu item. This is how you define a class. Again, you might be seeing, like, okay, there are a lot of, like, red things out there, and saying, okay, you know what, these are the variables yet, but it needs to be initialized because you have created those as a final. So so the way to initialize those, you have to use a constructor. So constructor, when you're calling, whenever you create an object of this particular class, you have to pass a constructor. So one more, so let me add the price as well. So now this is how you construct a constructor. So constant, and this item is the same name as the class name, and inside this one you put a curly brace. Okay, now inside this curly brace, you just, like, so you can always say submenu ID equals to this dot submenu ID, but there's a shorter way of doing that. So you just, like, put everything. So all of those things, you can use this keyword and this dot, just pass everything inside that curly braces. This is how you construct the constructor. So next time, when I want to create an object of this class, all you have to do where x equals to new item and pass all of these things. That's it. So then you will have an object, you of that particular class. So the role of the constructor you will see in, like, once you work on the real code, then you will understand, okay, why there is constructors are so important. And again, we talked about final and constant. So final is something, I'm not defining those as a constant. Final is something which needs to be initialized once the item is created. So why I mark this as final? Because I know these things are not going to change. Once a menu item is loaded on a, so for example, I have a menu item, and once somebody is, taking the order from the customer, you know what, those items are flexible. French fries are not going to change until unless, like, I change the price later on. But that's another piece. You change it once at the database. But again, when somebody is taking the order, these things are final. That means once they are initialized, once they are come from the database, loaded into my class, these are not going to change. So that's why I marked those final, and that's how I created the the constructor. Now why I did that? Because there's so many items again. So this is one class which defines a generic menu items, and there could be 100 of different dishes which are served in my kitchen. So all the dishes, they will comply to this particular data type. So that's the reason, you create the class. Okay. Now, let me tell you one more functionality of the class. There are factory methods you can write, and let me show you what those things are. So for example, so whenever you get those things from a database in XML format or JSON formats, I will take the JSON format here. So suppose you get this value from the JSON, and we talked about the map, so map data type. What is a map data type? Map data type stores the value in a key value feature. So key value. So for example, your key is menu ID is starter name. So let's say key is like, we said, okay, menu ID, and then we say, okay, and you say, say just 1 2 3 4. So this is the key, this is the value. So you store the data in this format, then this is called key value. So map is the data type which lets you store a key and the value. Key is a string, value right now we don't know. Okay, next thing is JSON. So this is a factory method. Again, we'll cover this in a detail, but I just want to quickly show you what is the importance of this thing. Okay, so you suppose you create a method like this from JSON. Now what this method does, it takes an item and it returns all of these things, these values. Let me show you another method here. So last time, remember, I explained you how to write this future asynchronous function. So in this function, what it does, pay attention to this one, item.json. So for example, I got this substring I got this data from the database, and its database could be anything. So database, is coming from MySQL or Firebase or MongoDB, it doesn't matter. So as long as your database is in the, data value, where did it go? So your data in this format, so you receive the data from the server, but you don't know what you're going to do with this data. So that's how you decode that data into the JSON. But this is very important to decrypt that data. We also call it deserialization. We will talk about that, later on once we work on the asynchronous programming. But right now, it's very important to understand. That's why it is so important to, have this kind of data model in your class. Then, it just becomes one line code. So if you plan ahead, and if you plan your class ahead, and you create this kind of factory function, you can just use one single line code, and immediately whatever data is coming from the server, you'll be able to get those things in a list. So again, we'll review this method 100 different times when we will work on the our code. But if you understand this functionality right now, it's going to make your life so easy. Okay, so that's all about the classes. Now let's talk about the packages. So what packages and libraries, actually they are a collection of classes. Again, we'll review this over and over and over again, but just pretend that suppose you have a lot of different functionalities. You group your classes together, create a package. So for example, in Flutter they have created a package for material, and again we'll cover this later. Okay, don't worry about this. So right now, that's not the what I want to show you. I want to show you, suppose you create a class, and then what you can do, so you can just when you say I'm talking about the inheritance now. So if you want to create a subclass of item, so suppose you want to create another item, and which is of something different, so you can just call the item and you don't need to recreate all of this over and over again. So that's called inheritance. So inheritance means you uh, get the behavior from your parent class, and then it becomes your own. So you don't need to go and recreate all of those methods again. So the reason I write this code, I just want to show you that, okay, there is a class called stateless widget. So again, we'll talk about what those things are, what VGS state, what is stateless, what is stateful. Don't worry about this. For example, there is a class which creates widget, stateless widgets. So if you just create a class my food code and you extend this, so that means whatever functionality is available in that particular class, you are going to get those in your class. That's called inheritance. Now what polymorphism is? Polymorphism is, suppose you want to override certain behavior. So in this case, I want to so stateless class has a method called build, and I want to override that. So for example, so again, it's little hard to explain that in the concept here, like when you're working just with the theory. I'm trying my best, but again, once you see the real code, I will talk about this over and over again. So here I am overriding the build behavior of the stateless widget. So I have everything. When I create it like this, there are 1,000 other functions I just bring into my class. So I'm inheriting to this stateless widget. So I am get all of those things, but I don't like one particular method from this um, this uh, this my parent class, which is I'm overriding. So I'm saying, okay, you know what, I don't like this, I'm going to do it my way. So that's called polymorphism. Okay. um, it's hard to grasp, but once we see the real code, we will understand a little better. Now let's talk about the last two things, abstract and encapsulation. So again, I'm going to give an example. Okay, so let me go to my example here. Again, I will share a link to my GitHub repository here, but I want to show you quickly, instead of typing, I just want to show you one real example. And we will review this like, over and over and over again, okay? So let me copy this code. This is an ideal example, and I couldn't find a use case, so that's why I'm doing it like this. But we are going to write everything from the scratch, okay, in near future, okay? Don't worry about that, that I'm not typing this code right now. I just want to give you an overview of the concept, and then we'll see what are abstract. Once you see those things in real action, you will understand. So abstract is a functionality when you hide the complexity of your entire app. So there's a difference when you, and encapsulation, when you hide the complexity of inside a function, inside a class, that means inside if within the sub functionality of your app. So difference is, for example, in my app I have a method like, so for example, say I abstract the entire functionality of the cart model. So for example, whenever somebody does something and I order something, it gets added to the cart. I order 5 different menu items and I add those into the cart. I want to capture this entire functionality and create a different class. That's called abstraction. Again, it's a very high level example. So example is when you hide the complexity of the app, that means all the payment related, all the cart related functionality will be grouped together in a class. Is called abstraction. Now, what is encapsulation? So when somebody is grouped together, so how do you add something to a cart? You have an array and you say, okay, I order this item, this item, this item, and then you go to another, say, side dish, and I order, you pick the 2 different things from that particular item. So everything you keep adding to those, to that cart, and then later you choose, or last minute you said, okay, you know what, I don't like this, I like this. So there are methods called add and remove, but you do not go directly and start modifying your the internal items of the cart. This is called encapsulation. So the difference between abstraction and encapsulation is they both help you hide the complexity of your app. The difference is abstract is for the entire app or the entire functionality. In encapsulation is like hiding the details of implementation within the class. So for example, here you see, whenever I use this ways of saying, what, internal private state of the card, private state of the order. So that's what I mean when I say these are encapsulation. And whenever something, I forgot to tell you in the beginning that if you mark something with underscore, this is private. So these are the private implementation detail of this particular class, which I am not allowed to change it from the outside. This is called encapsulation. So again, Abstraction is a process when you group together certain functionalities. So for example, all the cart related functionalities, I created a class. This is called in concept wise, I'll say it's an abstract class. And encapsulation is I will not allow outside people to come and start changing the private internal state of the cart. This is called encapsulation. What is the use? Again, the best thing is like when you start working on the app, then you will see what is the use. When you will see there's an action like these items are is accessed from the 5 different places. You can go from the menu and add something to that one, to your cart and orders. And at the same time your kitchen stuff, when somebody sees the order, okay, this order is complete, and he marks this as complete. So it's they if you everybody start changing your orders from 10 different places, you'll get in trouble. So that's why say encapsulation helps you hide the complexity or the private state of the cards, so that your program, the integrity of the programs becomes intact. So I think that's pretty much it. Enough with the concept. Sorry, there are a lot of things, different things still into the Dart language, and I haven't covered everything because it's not a typical Dart language tutorial. But definitely, I think I have covered enough details to get me started to build an app. So, and again, I think there are Dart. It could be as complex as you want. So once you start working on the Dart, there are a lot of different concepts will evolve, and you will have to learn those things. But for now, I just want to keep things very simple. This is all, I think, in my opinion, these are the enough details you will need to learn about the Dart. Please follow up this, please follow the rest of the tutorials. When I think it's very important for you, once you see the things in real action, how I am coding those things, how all these classes, objects, data types, they are helping me to build something, a real product, a real a real app. Then it will make a lot more sense. Then and that will, once you, these are just the fundamentals to help you understand about the Dart language. So if you have any questions, please feel free to again fork my GitHub repository, open any issue over there. I'll be happy to answer. But again, I hope you like this session, and I hope you like the follow-up session. This was the longest video, but rest of the videos will be very small. So because we will be just dealing with one particular functionality or the piece of the app. Well, thank you very much, and please subscribe to this video list. Thank you.